"My other daughter is here tonight," my father said into the microphone, raising his glass toward the back of the ballroom where I stood beside a service table. The chandeliers above the reception hall reflected off hundreds of crystal glasses, and for a moment every head in the room turned in my direction. "Chloe Anderson," he continued with a smile that felt rehearsed, "currently works as a server in Boston, though if you ask me, she's probably better described as an illiterate cleaner." Laughter spread across the guests like a ripple moving through water. My mother leaned closer to the microphone and added with a soft chuckle, "She's always been the dreamer in the family, never quite figured out real life." My sister Emily stood beside her new husband in a white gown worth more than my entire year of rent, smiling politely as if the joke were harmless tradition. I stood at the back of the room near the service entrance, exactly where my family had always believed I belonged. A few guests glanced at me with awkward sympathy, but most simply laughed along and lifted their glasses for the toast. No one in that room knew that the story my father had just told about me was about to collapse in front of all of them. For as long as I could remember, my family had always told the same story about me. Emily Anderson was the daughter who made our parents proud. I was the daughter who made them tired. That story had been repeated so many times over the years that eventually everyone around us began to believe it, including people who had never met me before. Growing up in our house outside Boston, success was never a quiet expectation. It was a performance. My father, Richard Anderson, worked in finance and treated achievement like currency that could be displayed at dinner parties. My mother, Linda Anderson, specialized in presenting our family as a perfect example of discipline and ambition. When guests visited, Emily's accomplishments were always the center of conversation. Debate trophies, academic awards, business plans she had drafted in college. My parents talked about her future like it was already guaranteed. I was different from the beginning, though not in ways they understood. While Emily chased recognition, I chased languages. I liked the way different cultures shaped conversations. When I was 12, I began borrowing language books from the public library while my sister prepared for academic competitions. By 15, I had become fascinated with Arabic. The sound of it, the rhythm, the complexity of meaning behind each phrase. My parents treated it like a hobby that would disappear eventually. By high school, the contrast between Emily and me had become a running joke in our family. Emily was the disciplined achiever. Chloe was the dreamer. My father repeated that line so often it became part of our family identity. During holidays, he would describe Emily's latest accomplishment and then glance at me with a smile that meant the punchline was coming. "And Chloe," he would say, "is still figuring things out." The truth was, I had been figuring things out just fine. By the time I entered college in Boston, I could already speak conversational Arabic. My professors noticed quickly. Within 2 years, I had been introduced to a consulting firm that worked in international trade negotiations. They needed someone fluent in Arabic who also understood American business
We all
culture.
knew this day was coming.
I left
especially
college
after
early
last
to
year's
take the
little
opportunity.
incident. But let's raise
To my
a glass
parents,
anyway.
that decision
Wow, did he
confirmed
really just say
everything
that?
they believed about me. They never asked what kind of negotiations I worked on or where the projects took me. When I mentioned traveling overseas, they assumed I was drifting from job to job. Eventually, I stopped explaining. 6 months before Emily's wedding, my life shifted again. A financial investigation involving the company I worked with froze several international projects overnight. Negotiations stopped. Offices closed temporarily. For the first time in years, everything paused. Instead of rushing back into the same industry, I returned to Boston and took a temporary job working at a restaurant downtown. After years of intense negotiations and constant travel, the simplicity felt almost peaceful. My family heard only one part of that story. Chloe, the server. Standing in the wedding reception now, listening to the laughter after my father's joke, I realized how powerful that narrative had become. Most of the people in this room had never spoken to me before tonight, yet they already knew exactly who I was supposed to be. Across the ballroom, I noticed a tall man speaking quietly with my brother-in-law, Daniel. Something about his presence felt different from the other guests. Calm, observant, the kind of person who watched before speaking. Then my father leaned toward him and pointed directly at me again. The man followed his gaze across the room. When our eyes met, he looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to remember something he had seen before. For as long as I could remember, the story about me inside my family had always been simple. Emily was the daughter who succeeded. I was the daughter who disappointed. My parents repeated that contrast so often that it eventually became the foundation of how everyone around us understood our lives. Growing up outside Boston, our house always felt like a stage where achievement was the only language that mattered. My father, Richard Anderson, measured life through results that could be presented to other people. Promotions, financial milestones, impressive connections. My mother, Linda Anderson, handled the presentation of that success with careful precision. When guests visited our home, conversations naturally shifted toward Emily's accomplishments. Emily never seemed uncomfortable with that attention. She worked hard and excelled at almost everything she tried. In school, she was the one teachers mentioned during parent meetings. Debate championships, academic awards, internships arranged through my father's network. By the time she graduated college, everyone around us already spoke about her future like it was something inevitable. I moved through the same house in a very different way. Where Emily loved competition, I loved curiosity. I spent hours in the public library reading about cultures that felt impossibly far away from suburban Massachusetts. At 12, I began experimenting with language books simply because I liked the challenge of understanding something unfamiliar. Spanish came easily, French followed, but the language that captured my attention completely was Arabic. Arabic felt like solving a puzzle that never ended. The sounds were different. The grammar moved in directions English never did, and every phrase carried layers of meaning shaped by culture and history. I studied it quietly for years. By the time I entered high school, I could already read and write basic Arabic sentences. My parents treated it as a harmless distraction. Whenever relatives visited, my father would introduce Emily as the brilliant daughter headed for a powerful career. When the conversation turned toward me, the tone changed slightly. "Chloe likes languages," he would say with a polite smile, "still figuring out what she wants to do with them." That sentence followed me through most of my teenage years. By the time I entered college in Boston, my interest in languages had turned into something far more serious. I chose a program focused on international communication and Middle Eastern studies. My professors noticed quickly how comfortable I was with Arabic compared to other students. During my second year, one of those professors invited me to meet with a consulting group that specialized in international trade negotiations. Their work involved partnerships between American investors and companies in the Middle East. They needed someone who could translate not only language, but also cultural expectations between both sides. The meeting lasted less than an hour. 2 weeks later, I was offered a position assisting with negotiations that involved companies operating in Dubai and Doha. The role was demanding and unpredictable, but it was also an opportunity most students would never receive. I left college to accept the job. When I told my parents, they barely reacted. My father assumed I had simply dropped out because the academic pressure was too difficult. My mother asked if I planned to go back later once I figured things out. I tried explaining that the work involved international trade negotiations and complex business discussions, but the explanation never seemed to land. From their perspective, the conclusion was obvious. Chloe had left college without a clear plan. The strange thing was that my life quickly became far more structured than they imagined. Within months, I was traveling overseas, sitting in conference rooms where conversations moved between Arabic and English, while investors discussed deals worth more money than I had ever imagined. But those details never became part of the story my family told about me. When I returned home for holidays, my parents asked about restaurant jobs or temporary work, never about negotiations or travel. Eventually, I stopped correcting them. Standing in the wedding reception years later, listening to guests laugh after my father's speech, I realized how deeply that version of me had settled into everyone's expectations. Across the ballroom, the tall man beside my brother-in-law, Daniel, was still watching me. Most guests had already returned to their conversations after the toast, but he hadn't. His attention remained steady, thoughtful, almost analytical. Then Daniel leaned toward him and said something quietly. The man's expression changed slightly, as if the name he had just heard had triggered a memory he was trying to place. And a moment later, he began walking toward me. The first time I stepped out of Dubai International Airport at 21 years old, the heat felt like walking into another world. The air shimmered above the pavement, and the skyline rose in front of me like something built from ambition alone. Towers of glass reflected the desert sun, while luxury cars moved silently past the entrance. I remember standing there with a single suitcase and wondering how my life had moved so far from the quiet streets outside Boston. The consulting firm that hired me specialized in international trade negotiations, particularly partnerships between Western investors and companies across the Middle East. Their work required more than translation. Deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars often depended on subtle cultural understanding. A word translated incorrectly could damage trust. A gesture misunderstood could stall negotiations for months. Arabic was not just a language in those rooms, it was a signal of respect. During my first weeks with the firm, I spent most of my time listening. Senior negotiators spoke carefully while investors watched each other's reactions more closely than the documents in front of them. I learned quickly that silence could be more powerful than speech in certain meetings. If two partners trusted each other personally, contracts were signed faster. If trust broke, no legal document could repair the damage. A few months into that job, I was introduced to Khalid Al-Nasser. Even before meeting him, I had heard the stories circulating in financial circles. Khalid was one of the most influential independent traders in the global gold industry. His companies operated across several countries, and his negotiations involved governments, mining firms, and international investors. But when I met him for the first time in a private conference room in Dubai, he did not look like the kind of man who needed to dominate a room to control it. He spoke quietly. Our first conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes and took place entirely in Arabic. Khalid did not ask simple questions. Instead, he moved directly into complex discussion about cultural negotiation practices between Gulf investors and Western financial institutions. It felt less like an interview and more like a test. At the end of the conversation, he looked toward the consulting director and said something that surprised everyone in the room. He wanted me assigned permanently to his negotiation team. Over the next several years, my life moved through cities that once existed only in books I read as a teenager. Dubai, London, Doha, occasionally New York. I sat beside Khalid during negotiations where investors discussed partnerships involving gold reserves, logistics networks, and supply contracts that stretched across continents. My role was rarely visible in those rooms. I translated conversations between Arabic and English, but often I also explained the cultural meaning behind certain phrases or traditions. Western negotiators sometimes spoke too directly, while Gulf investors expected a slower rhythm of conversation that built trust before discussing numbers. My job was to make sure neither side misunderstood the other. More than once, a deal that seemed close to collapsing recovered because someone had clarified a single sentence. The strange part was how little of that life existed inside my family's understanding of me. Whenever I returned home to Boston for short visits, the conversations with my parents followed the same pattern. My father asked whether I planned to finish college someday. My mother wondered if I had found stable work yet. I tried explaining the negotiations or the travel, but the details always sounded unrealistic to them. Eventually, I stopped correcting their assumptions. 6 months before my sister's wedding, everything changed overnight. News broke across international financial networks that Khalid Al-Nasser had been detained during a complex financial investigation involving cross-border commodity transactions. The situation was confusing even for those of us inside his business circle. Legal teams stepped in immediately, and within days, several of Khalid's companies temporarily suspended operations while authorities reviewed financial records. For the negotiation teams, the impact was immediate. Projects froze, contracts paused, Meetings scheduled months in advance were canceled within hours. The consulting firm I worked for lost several major accounts connected to Khalid's business network. Within 2 weeks, the office in Dubai closed temporarily. I returned to Boston with no clear timeline for when those negotiations might restart. After years of constant travel and pressure, the sudden silence felt almost surreal. Instead of jumping immediately into another negotiation firm, I decided to pause. I took a temporary job at a restaurant downtown while I considered what direction I wanted my career to move next. To me, it was simply a break between chapters. To my family, it became the confirmation they had always expected. Chloe, the server. Standing in my sister's wedding reception now, watching the tall man approach across the ballroom, I wondered whether he had just heard that same version of my story. Because the way he was looking at me suggested he might remember something very different. The music softened as the master of ceremonies stepped back to the center of the ballroom and raised the microphone again. Conversations faded gradually across the room while guests returned to their seats with champagne glasses in their hands. The moment for family toasts had arrived, the part of the evening designed to celebrate memories and offer warm stories about the bride and groom. My father stood up with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the entire room was ready to listen. Richard Anderson adjusted his jacket, took the microphone, and lifted his glass toward Emily and Daniel. The chandeliers above reflected light across the polished marble floor while cameras turned in his direction. My father had always been comfortable speaking in front of wealthy audiences. Years in finance had trained him to sound authoritative even when telling simple stories. He began exactly the way everyone expected. He spoke about Emily as the daughter who had always made our family proud. He described her discipline in school, her intelligence, her determination to succeed in business. Guests nodded politely while listening to the familiar tone of a proud father praising his accomplished daughter. Emily smiled gracefully beside her new husband, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. For a few moments, the speech felt perfectly ordinary. Then my father's tone shifted slightly. He glanced across the ballroom toward the back of the room where I stood near a service table, half in the shadows beside the catering staff entrance. I recognized that look instantly. It was the expression he used whenever he was about to turn a story into a joke. "Of course," he said lightly into the microphone. "Every family has more than one story." A few guests chuckled politely. My father raised his glass slightly in my direction. "Our other daughter, Chloe, is here tonight," he continued, smiling toward the crowd. Several heads turned to follow his gesture. I felt the weight of their curiosity move across the room. She took a very different path in life. The guests leaned forward just enough to show interest. "She currently works as a server in Boston," my father said, "though if you ask me, she might be better described as an illiterate cleaner." Laughter spread quickly through several tables near the front of the room. Not cruel laughter, just the comfortable reaction of guests enjoying a harmless family anecdote. A few people glanced toward me with awkward smiles, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh or look sympathetic. My mother leaned toward the microphone beside him and added softly, "Chloe has always had her head in the clouds, languages and strange ideas, but never anything practical." Emily did not interrupt. She stood beside Daniel in her white wedding dress, smiling politely as if the moment were simply part of the evening's entertainment. I remained exactly where I was, standing beside the service table with a champagne glass in my hand. Years earlier, I might have felt the sting of humiliation rising in my chest. But tonight, the words passed through me almost calmly. I had heard variations of this story for most of my life. Across the ballroom, however, someone else was watching carefully. The tall man who had been speaking with Daniel earlier stood near one of the investor tables, his attention fixed on the scene unfolding near the microphone. While several guests laughed along with my father's story, he did not smile at all. Instead, he studied me with a quiet intensity that felt completely different from the other reactions in the room. Daniel leaned toward him and whispered something, perhaps explaining who I was supposed to be in the family hierarchy. My father continued his speech, unaware that the guest beside Daniel was paying very close attention. "She never quite understood discipline," my father added casually. "Foreign languages were always a mystery to her." More laughter drifted through the ballroom. The tall man's expression shifted slightly. He said something quietly to Daniel, then turned his head toward my father as if confirming what he had just heard. My father finished the toast with a confident flourish. "To Emily and Daniel," he said proudly. "A future built on intelligence, hard work, and the right choices." Guests raised their glasses. Applause filled the room as the music slowly returned and conversations restarted. But the tall man had already begun moving through the crowd. People stepped aside instinctively as he walked across the ballroom. When he reached the open space near the center of the room, he turned his head and looked directly at me again. Then, without warning, he spoke a short sentence in Arabic. The sound of the language cut through the laughter and music like a quiet signal, and the entire room went silent. The sentence he spoke in Arabic was simple, but the tone behind it carried quiet authority. Even though most of the guests in the ballroom did not understand the words, the sudden change in language made the room pause. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses hovered halfway to lips. Everyone sensed that something unusual had just happened. For a moment, I did nothing. I looked at the man standing near the center of the ballroom, trying to understand why the sound of his voice felt strangely familiar. His expression was calm and focused, the expression of someone observing rather than performing. The sentence he had spoken was not mocking. It was a test. He had asked if I understood Arabic. I set my champagne glass gently on the edge of the table beside me. Then I answered him in Arabic. My reply was clear and steady, the rhythm of the language returning as naturally as breathing. I did not simply say yes. Instead, I responded politely in the formal tone often used in professional introductions, asking whether he was referring to conversational Arabic or the specialized terminology used in business negotiations. The reaction in the room was immediate. Guests who had just been laughing moments earlier stared at me with confusion. They did not understand the words, but they understood the confidence. The cadence of the exchange sounded nothing like the hesitant speech of someone repeating memorized phrases. The tall man stepped forward slowly. People moved aside without needing to be asked. Daniel followed behind him, his expression uncertain, as if he had suddenly lost control of a situation he believed he understood. When the man reached the table where I stood, he spoke again in Arabic. This time his words were longer and far more specific. He mentioned negotiation structures used in Gulf commodity markets and referred to a partnership model often used in gold supply agreements. It was the kind of sentence that only someone deeply familiar with that industry would use as a test. I answered without hesitation. Our conversation shifted instantly into professional territory. I responded with the correct terminology, referencing negotiation protocols commonly used in Dubai and Doha. I mentioned a specific cultural approach often required when Western investors worked with family-owned Gulf companies. The man listened carefully. After a few moments, his expression changed from curiosity to recognition. "You worked with Khalid al-Nasser," he said in Arabic. The name hung quietly between us. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied. "Several negotiations in Dubai and London." A murmur spread across the guests closest to us. Even those who did not understand Arabic recognized the name. Khalid al-Nasser was known in international financial circles, especially among investors connected to commodity markets. Daniel looked completely lost. "What are they saying?" he whispered toward my father, who had walked closer to the conversation. The tall man finally turned toward the room and switched back to English. "My name is Sheikh Omar al-Rahman," he said calmly. The effect of the introduction was immediate. Several investors standing near the front tables exchanged surprised looks. The name carried weight in global financial circles. Sheikh Omar was one of the most influential figures in the international gold market and a longtime business partner of Khalid al-Nasser. He looked back at me again, studying my face carefully. "I remember you now," he continued. You were present during negotiations in Dubai 3 years ago. Khalid relied on you to bridge communication between our partners." The silence in the ballroom deepened. My father stared at me as if the person standing in front of him had suddenly become someone else entirely. My mother's smile had disappeared completely. Emily and Daniel stood near the center of the room while guests around them whispered quietly. Sheikh Omar continued speaking with the calm confidence of someone simply stating facts. "Miss Anderson was one of the most capable interpreters involved in those negotiations," he said. "Her understanding of both language and cultural protocol helped prevent several agreements from collapsing." A few guests turned toward my father with expressions that were no longer amused. Only minutes earlier, he had introduced me as an illiterate cleaner. Now the story he had told about me was beginning to unravel in front of every person in the room. Sheikh Omar studied the reaction around him for a moment before turning back to me. "Khalid's situation has temporarily interrupted many projects," he said thoughtfully. "However, new negotiations will soon begin again." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a simple business card. "I would like to speak with you tomorrow," he said, placing the card on the table in front of me. The room fell even quieter. "Because someone with your experience may be exactly what we need." For several long seconds after Sheikh Omar placed the card on the table, no one in the ballroom said anything. The silence felt heavier than the laughter that had filled the room earlier. Conversations that had once flowed easily now stalled as guests tried to understand what had just happened. My father was the first person to speak. Richard Anderson let out a short, strained laugh and stepped forward as if he could still repair the situation through confidence alone. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, glancing between Sheikh Omar and me. "My daughter has always worked in restaurants. She's never been involved in international business." The words sounded less certain than he probably intended. Sheikh Omar did not appear confused. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward my father and regarded him with calm patience, the way someone might listen to a statement that simply did not match the facts. "I am quite certain there is no misunderstanding," he replied. "Miss Anderson worked alongside Khalid al-Nasser during several negotiations in the gold market. Her role was essential in translating both language and cultural intent." The guests standing closest to us exchanged quiet looks. My father blinked as if the sentence had taken longer than expected to process. "That can't be right," he said. "Chloe left college years ago. She never mentioned anything like that." Sheikh Omar's expression remained steady. "In our business," he said calmly, "competence is remembered more clearly than academic records." A few people near the investor tables murmured quietly. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice careful but tense. "Perhaps there's some confusion about names," he suggested. "My sister-in-law works as a server in Boston. She's not involved in international negotiations." The correction sounded forced even before he finished the sentence. Sheikh Omar glanced briefly at Daniel, then back at me. "Your current work does not erase your previous experience," he said simply. "Miss Anderson was present in negotiations involving partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars." That statement spread through the crowd faster than the earlier laughter had. Investors who had attended the wedding as Daniel's potential partners now watched the conversation with growing interest. Reputation mattered in rooms like this. So did accuracy. My mother finally spoke. Linda Anderson stepped forward cautiously, her voice softer than usual. "Chloe," she said, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this?" The question floated in the air between us. I looked at her calmly. "I tried," I said. No one laughed. My father's expression shifted from disbelief to something more defensive. "You never explained it clearly," he said quickly, as if the responsibility still belonged somewhere else. "You never asked," I replied. The words landed with quiet finality. Across the room, Emily stood beside Daniel, her smile gone entirely now. Several guests near them whispered while glancing toward me and Sheikh Omar. The wedding reception had transformed from celebration into something closer to an unexpected business meeting. Sheikh Omar seemed almost unaware of the tension surrounding us. Instead, he looked thoughtfully at the ballroom, then back at me. Khalid's situation has delayed several ongoing negotiations, he said. However, new partnerships are currently being prepared. The gold market continues moving regardless of temporary disruptions. He gestured briefly toward the business card still resting on the table. I am evaluating a new investment project that will require someone capable of navigating both Arabic negotiations and Western financial structures, he continued. Several investors leaned slightly closer, listening carefully now. You demonstrated that ability before, he said to me, and I believe you could do so again. He paused for a moment, allowing the meaning of the offer to settle. I would like you to visit my office tomorrow morning, he said. There is a proposal I would like to discuss with you. Another wave of silence moved through the room. My father looked down at the card as if it represented evidence against him in a trial he had not realized he was attending. Daniel's expression had shifted into something blank and careful, the confident host of the evening suddenly unsure how to manage the narrative unfolding around him. Sheikh Omar nodded politely toward me before stepping back. I will expect your call, he said. Then he turned and began walking toward the exit of the ballroom. Guests moved aside instinctively as he passed. I picked up the card and read the name printed across the center. When I looked up again, my parents and my sister were staring at me with the same expression. For the first time in my life, they had no idea who I actually was. The music eventually returned to the ballroom, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no one could pretend not to notice. Conversations restarted slowly, quieter than before, as if the entire room was trying to process the same unexpected realization. Only an hour earlier, I had been the invisible daughter standing near the catering entrance. Now I could feel dozens of eyes watching me from across the reception hall. For the first time that evening, I was no longer part of the background. Several guests who had laughed during my father's speech now studied me with a completely different expression. A few of the investors standing near the front tables whispered quietly among themselves while glancing in my direction. Others seemed careful not to look directly at my father at all. Across the ballroom, Richard Anderson remained standing near the center of the room as if the floor beneath him had shifted slightly. My father was a man who normally controlled every social situation he entered, but tonight something had slipped beyond his reach. My mother approached me first. Linda Anderson walked across the room with the controlled posture she used whenever she was trying to maintain composure in public. When she reached my table, she lowered her voice so only I could hear her. "Chloe," she said carefully, "why didn't you tell us about any of this?" I looked at her for a moment before answering. "I did," I said quietly. Her expression tightened as if she were searching her memory for conversations she had never taken seriously. For years, she had assumed my explanations were exaggerations or temporary opportunities that would eventually fade. Now those assumptions had become difficult to defend. A moment later, my father joined us. Richard Anderson glanced at the business card still resting in my hand. The name printed on it had already begun circulating through the reception hall. Sheikh Omar Al-Rahman was not just another wealthy guest. His presence at the wedding had originally been intended to impress potential investors connected to my sister's new business plans. Now the situation looked very different. "You should have explained your situation more clearly," my father said finally, his voice low but firm. The statement sounded less like an accusation and more like an attempt to protect his pride. I met his eyes calmly. "You never asked," I replied. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Across the ballroom, Emily stood beside Daniel while several business guests spoke with them in quiet voices. I could see tension in Daniel's posture as he tried to answer their questions. Only an hour earlier, he had introduced himself proudly as the man marrying into the Anderson family. Now, the same guests seemed more interested in the story they had just witnessed unfold. Reputation mattered in rooms like this. Investors paid attention to how people treated others, especially when those people turned out to have influence in unexpected places. Emily eventually walked toward me. Her wedding dress moved softly across the marble floor as she approached. though her expression no longer carried the confident smile she had worn earlier in the evening. "You could have told me," she said quietly when she reached my table. The sentence sounded less like anger and more like frustration. "This is my wedding," she added. "You made the entire room turn against us." I considered her words carefully before answering. "I didn't say anything during Dad's speech," I said. "I didn't ask Sheikh Omar to speak either." Emily glanced down at the card in my hand before looking back at my face. For a moment, she seemed ready to argue further, but the words never came. Instead, she turned and walked back toward Daniel, who was still trying to manage conversations with several guests near the investors' table. A few minutes later, I stepped outside the ballroom into the cool night air. The estate's gardens were quiet compared to the tension inside the reception hall. Soft lights illuminated the stone path between trees, while distant music drifted through the open doors behind me. I walked slowly along the path and looked down at the business card again. Tomorrow morning, I would call the number printed beneath Sheikh Omar's name. For the first time in months, I felt something that had disappeared when my career collapsed earlier that year. Possibility. Behind me, through the tall windows of the mansion, I could still see the movement of guests inside the reception hall. My family remained there among them, trying to understand how the story they had told about me for so many years had fallen apart in less than 10 minutes. But standing there in the quiet garden, I realized something important. The truth had not changed tonight. Only the audience had. The morning after my sister's wedding, the city of Boston looked exactly the same as it had the day before, but something inside my life had shifted permanently. Sunlight reflected across the harbor outside the hotel window, while traffic moved along the streets below, completely unaware that the quiet storm inside my family had just begun settling into something real. The business card Sheikh Omar had placed on the table the night before rested on the desk beside my phone. I stared at it for a long moment before dialing the number printed beneath his name. The call was answered almost immediately. A calm voice greeted me in English, then switched to Arabic the moment I introduced myself. It was clear that my call had been expected. Within a few minutes, a meeting was scheduled for later that afternoon in an office building overlooking downtown Boston. Walking into that office felt very different from walking into my sister's wedding reception the night before. There were no chandeliers, no wedding speeches, and no family expectations hovering in the air. Instead, there was a quiet conference room with large windows overlooking the harbor and a table covered with documents related to international gold markets. Sheikh Omar greeted me with the same composed expression he had carried at the wedding. "I am glad you called," he said as we sat down. The conversation moved quickly into familiar territory. He explained that Khalid al-Nasser's legal situation was slowly becoming clearer and that several delayed negotiations were beginning to restart. Investors were still cautious, but the global gold market had not stopped moving. Several new partnerships were forming. "What these negotiations require," Sheikh Omar said, sliding a folder across the table toward me, "is someone who understands both the language and the cultural structure behind them." Inside the folder were documents outlining a new project involving supply agreements between Middle Eastern investors and Western financial groups. The scale of the project was enormous, but the work itself felt familiar. Translation was only part of the role. Cultural interpretation, negotiation rhythm, and relationship management were the real skills required to keep deals like this alive. "You did this successfully before," Sheikh Omar said, "and I believe you can do it again." The offer was direct. If I accepted, I would be joining the negotiation team responsible for facilitating communication between several international partners. The work would involve travel again, meetings in Dubai, London, and occasionally New York. For the first time in months, the direction of my life felt clear again. I agreed. Over the following months, my schedule filled with meetings, negotiations, and travel across several countries. Each conversation reminded me that the skills I had spent years developing had never disappeared. They had simply been waiting for the right opportunity to return. News of what happened at my sister's wedding also continued traveling quietly through the same business circles my family had hoped to impress. Investors talked. Stories moved quickly in rooms where reputation mattered. A father publicly mocking his daughter as an illiterate cleaner, only to discover she had once worked in international negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was the kind of story people remembered. My parents called several times in the weeks after the wedding. The conversations were careful at first, almost formal, as if they were speaking to someone they had not truly known before. My mother asked questions about my work that she had never asked in the past. My father listened more than he spoke, but something inside me had already changed. For the first time in my life, I no longer needed their approval to feel certain about who I was. 1 year later, I found myself standing on a balcony overlooking Boston Harbor again, after returning from another international negotiation trip. The city lights shimmered across the water while I thought back to the moment my father had raised his glass and called me an illiterate cleaner in front of an entire ballroom. At the time, it had felt like humiliation. Now, it felt like the moment the truth finally stepped into the light. The real revenge had never been about embarrassing my family or proving anyone wrong in front of an audience. The real victory was much quieter than that. I had built a life that did not depend on anyone else's version of my story. Sometimes people decide who you are long before they understand your reality. They repeat that version of you so often that the world begins to believe it. But every once in a while, the truth arrives at exactly the moment no one expects. And when it does, the entire story changes. If you've ever experienced a moment when someone underestimated you or judged you based on a story that wasn't true, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment in this story stood out to you the most. And if stories about justice, family drama, and quiet comebacks resonate with you, make sure you stay with this channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for spending this time with me. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.